Thanks for all coming out to watch me talk about the basics of design. Yeah, let's just hop right in then. So, hi, my name is Hannah. I'm the president of Design ECI, and yeah, just here to talk about some design basics for you guys. If any of you guys are working on projects for the Design-a-thon, this is a really good place to get started. Okay, so why should you guys care about design? Well, design keeps us connected to the world and helps us navigate our way through physical and digital spaces. So it's really important that we design in a way that's intuitive for people to follow. And it can be really influential by understanding our behavior and demographics. So good design really helps ideas and content shine because users will know how to understand it. All right. So there's three different design areas in general. There's graphic design, visual or user interface design, and then UX design. So graphic design is more about visual communication through typography, photography, illustration, etc. And we're going to touch upon that a little bit today. But the main focus of this workshop is on visual design, which is more about like the look and the feel and even texture interactivity of a digital product. And yeah, and then for UX design, that's more about focusing on the users in the design process in order to create digital or physical products that are useful and intuitive to interact with. Okay, so moving on to the design basics. First, we're going to touch upon hierarchy. So hierarchy is the principle of arranging elements to show their order of importance. And you could do this in a variety of ways through size, contrast, and proximity. And visual hierarchy relates to all elements on the screen, not just text. And so here's like a really simple example of that. Obviously, the biggest elements on the screen, you'll read first, and then it sort of progresses from there. And so to give an example of that, here you can see a body of text about Design-a-thon at UCI and joining Design at UCI. And right now it's all pretty uniform. And that sort of makes it a little bit hard to digest at once. So one thing that we can change is the size of certain elements. So in this example, you can see that we increase the size of these headers. So what is Design-a-thon at UCI and interested in joining Design at UCI became slightly bigger. And as you can see from the before, it helps bring structure into this sort of body of text. Another thing that we could change is contrast. So specifically the contrast of colors can help again bring structure and guide the user through or guide the viewer through what you're trying to show them. And so here you can see we changed the color of the headers to become this dark blue. And by providing a contrast between that and the text color or the body text color, again, brings hierarchy to what you want to bring the user's attention to. Okay, and what about proximity? So right now, as you can sort of see, like all the elements are spaced out pretty uniform, but by changing the distance between certain elements, you can group things in a way that provides proximity and hierarchy. So here you can see the before and after, and by grouping these, you know, to become more like things are more proximity is sorry, by making things more close to each other, you can group them. So here's the grouping. Sorry for stuttering. But yeah, so before and after. So here's just what we had before we changed the size, the contrast and the proximity of things. And here on the right, you can see what that looks like afterwards. And so again, hierarchy is really important for design. Another aspect of hierarchy is the layout of things. So there's two common ways people sort of track or skim a page or a website. So there's F pattern and then there's Z pattern. And so F pattern usually starts with the user tracking like the top and then skimming from the left side and only viewing things when they see something that catches their eye. So that usually creates sort of like an F shape, as you see here. And so this is usually used more when there's a lot of text on the screen and people only want to skim and look at things that catch their eye, like images or headers. And then there's the Z-shaped layout. And this layout is a lot better for things that have more images on the screen. So like, or CTAs and buttons. So here you can see it really highlights like the sign up and the create account, and then this big body, big text over here. And so you use different patterns for different kinds of pages. Again, this one's better for text, and then the Z-shaped is better for images. Okay, moving on to readability. Readability is the arrangement of fonts and words in order to make written content flow in a simple and easy to read manner. So this is really centered on line height and line length, and defining those is really important in your design. So for line height, this is the vertical distance between lines of text and is expressed either in numerical values like 27 pixels or percentages like 125%. And a really good rule of thumb is to set line height to 1.5 times or 150% the font size. And so to give an example of that, here you can see what the same font size looks like when it has different line heights. And so on the left-hand side, you can see when the line height is a little bit too short, it really clutters the text and it makes it really hard to read. And so by making the line height 1.5 times the font size, it gives it a lot more breathability and readability. Okay, so that was line height, but what about line length? So this is the width of the paragraph, or the amount that the text spans. And using up all the space on a page isn't actually the best idea. Usually a good rule of thumb is having 40 to 75 characters in line length, as you can see in this example. All right, so moving on to that, let's talk about clean design. So clean design usually means uncluttered, simple, and easy to parse. So one aspect of that is using white space. And white space doesn't necessarily mean it has to be white, but it's really just any empty or unmarked space in a design. So whether that's the space between the layouts, the lines of paragraphs, between paragraphs, between different elements, and so on. And so, you know, creating empty space, it's really a choice, and it's used to highlight certain things and focus certain things in your design. So you have to be pretty purposeful with when you incorporate white space in your design. And again, it also just lets your design breathe. Another way to create clean design is using outlines, which help box content and create groups. But like I showed you earlier, that you can also use the rule of proximity to do the same thing. Another way you can have clean design is using shadows. So, you know, shadows are typically used to show the interactivity of certain elements like buttons and so on. And shadows actually don't have to be gray. So a fun little tip is to use the shadow color or base the shadow color on the color of the actual object in front of it for a more convincing shadow. So you can see an example here. The middle element has no shadow, which makes it pretty flat. But if you want to elevate it off the screen, a nice way is to use a shadow. So the left-hand side shows the gray shadow, and then the right-hand side shows the blue shadow, which looks more convincing. And then here's just an example of like using outlines versus shadows. So they're just two different techniques. Outlines are a bit more boxier, but shadows are a nice way to have a subtle sort of difference between the element and the background, and it's a way to separate and group content. All right, and moving on to branding. So key brand elements make a brand stand out from competitors and make it more recognizable to consumers. So like what you saw just now, like Google's family of tools and softwares, like they're all pretty different, but in terms of branding, they make it really consistent and it's really easy to recognize. So one aspect of branding is the colors that you use, and color is one of the most important elements in design as well as with branding. And a golden rule used in interior design as well as graphic and UX UI design is the 60-30-10 rule. So this means like 60% is the main color, 30% is the secondary color, and 10% is the accent color. So by keeping this sort of color scheme, it really helps keep your designs consistent throughout the whole product. And again, establishes a kind of branding and personality. Another thing though to keep in mind with colors is making sure that you're picking colors that are inclusive to people, especially people with vision deficiencies or impairments. And so one way to sort of test if your colors have enough contrast is to try your colors like in grayscale instead and see if it still contrasts well. Another thing you can use is like, there's a lot of plugins available on like design softwares as well as even like on Chrome. So I personally use Spectrum, which is like a Chrome extension, and it allows you to test like your screen to see if your designs, how your designs look with different color vision deficiencies. So yeah, really important to keep that in mind. Okay, and then here are the 4 types of color schemes. So triadics, when you plot 3 points, analogous is being 3 colors next to each other, complementary is being colors across, and monochromatic is using the same color, but you can use different tones of that color. But color's not just for aesthetics, you can also have interactive colors. So think of like the background color. Usually you don't interact with that color. So for example, white, but the background could be really any color. The secondary color would be used for interactions like buttons, and then denotative colors are important too. So think of green or red or orange, etc. These colors can be used to convey information, and they're not just for aesthetics. So, you know, usually green is used for success, red is used for error, and orange or yellow is used for warning. And even blue can be a denotative color. So blue in color psychology is related to like loyalty and trust. And so like in this example, it could be used for like an information button or hyperlinks and things like that. Okay. Let me check the chat. Oh, the website for colorblind, the one that I mentioned is Spectrum on Chrome, but you can also find it if you just search it up like for any design software using like Figma. I think they also have plugins that you could use within the software to test it. But we're gonna link this afterwards so you can find it later. Okay, so next is typography for branding. This is like the font families or font pairings used within your design, and you can find a bunch of free fonts on Google. Okay, but the fonts that you choose should be purposeful. For example, like a law firm might use or would probably use a different font than a design agency. A good rule of thumb is like the difference between serif and sans serif fonts. Serif fonts usually convey a more sophisticated, professional sort of feel, whereas I find that sans serif fonts can be a little bit more playful. But again, just like, you know, use your best judgment, figure out like what the font conveys and if it fits with the message you're trying to give to your users. Okay, now moving on to like typefaces for typography. So display typefaces are typically more eccentric, as this example shows. Generally, they're used for headers or larger text that is easier to read rather than for large bodies of text. So here's an example of like what it looks like when it's like typed in a large amount with a small size. As you can see, it's really difficult to read. So instead, for this kind of stuff, you want to use text typefaces. So these are designed to be read in large quantities and at smaller sizes. Okay, moving on to illustrations for branding. They help to provide a visual representation or example of what is being shared. So here is just a long list of, you know, places you can find free illustrations to use in your own projects. Again, I'll link it later at the end of this workshop, but really nice to give a visual representation of what you're trying to show. Okay, buttons are also part of branding. They communicate action and they should be pretty consistent across your whole product. They can be clickable or non-clickable, and you can choose the design to communicate some sort of hierarchy. So here's just some examples. Okay, icons are also part of branding. They communicate meaning, and they're supposed to be understood without text. And generally, you want to use familiar icons. You don't want to think too outside of the box, otherwise your users won't understand what that icon is trying to communicate. It's also best to test the scalability of icons throughout you know, your project timeline, because sometimes if you scale it too big or too small, it sort of impacts the way it looks. So make sure you check that out, and maybe you might have to reconsider if it doesn't scale the way that you want it to scale. And it's also really important to keep icons consistent. So here's an example of inconsistent versus consistent icons. As you can see, the inconsistent ones just do not communicate branding very well, and they're pretty ineffective, whereas keeping it consistent throughout your product really helps to establish a cleaner design. And so here's just a place you can find free icon kits that help you keep stuff consistent throughout your own designs. Okay, and then last note, I touched a little bit about this for colors, but accessibility. So accessibility means that websites, tools, and technologies are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. And so this is, really important. Not only does it improve overall user experience and satisfaction, but it just enhances your brand, drives innovation, even can improve your search engine optimization. So it's super important that you follow certain accessibility standards. Specifically, there's some web accessibility standards you could find online that relate to color contrast, text size, etc. And so again, it's really important to make sure that your designs are inclusive and a large range of audiences can view it and use it. Okay, so all this to say, to try to design through the user's perspective. Where are they looking first? What are they trying to accomplish? How do they perceive the quality of the product? And by keeping all of this in mind, you can design something that's intuitive and easy to use, and a delight to use for users. All right, that's it. And here are all the resources that I mentioned throughout the workshop in case you guys want to use them. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for listening.